If you believe to the slightest degree that your thoughts have an effect on reality, it means our reality will always be equal to the way we think and react. We could never have anything new happening because our environment is causing us to think. It's as if you're asleep. And what we know from neuroscience is that once the brain turns on an automatic program, it takes very little effort for the brain to run from that point on. So we live most of our waking day asleep, responding to the environment and allowing the environment to turn on circuits. So then, how do we change that? How do we begin to make the difference?
Dr. Joe Dispenza is the world's leading expert in the realm of neuroscience and epigenetics. His transformational journey began after a brutal cycling accident where doctors told him that he would never walk again. He has since gone on to write several New York Times best-selling books, become one of the highest-paid speakers in the world, and inspire millions of people globally with his story. In this exclusive speech from the Celebrate Your Life stage, Joe Dispenza shares with us the keys to reprogram your mind, align your thoughts with actions, and achieve real change. Special thanks to Liz Dawn for partnering with us to release this exclusive content on our YouTube channel. Enjoy.
How many people saw the movie What the Bleep Do You Know? That's pretty good. I'm in good company. I was doing a talk in Las Vegas last month, and I asked, and there was like 2 people out of 1,900 people that saw it. I said, you guys get out much? So, you know why everybody loved the movie? You know, when I travel around the world and I talk to people and everybody's excited about the movie is because everybody comes up to me and says the same thing. They say, you know, that movie touched me in such a unique way because it was everything I already knew but didn't know how to put into words. Yes? And if we can take different avenues of science, different scientific data, and combine them in a unique way to give us a greater understanding of the nature of reality, it's refreshing, isn't it? And if there's a storyline about somebody who's handicapped, physically and emotionally, who views reality through the filter of her past, everything that she perceives is equal to her latest and greatest emotional storm. And if you can show the progression of thought and its influence on our lives, and at the same time show how thoughts have an effect on the physical body, and how this simple concept in neuroscience is mind making you feel, or how you feel is making you think. Which is it? But if you can combine those different areas of science, quantum physics, neurobiology, neurophysiology, neuroscience, genetics, emotions, and piece them together in a unique way, it gives people permission to change. It gives people permission to begin to understand that the movie is about you, that everybody is included, independent of your gender, your race, your creed, your culture, your past, your genetics, your handicaps, your conditions. That if you're alive and you're functioning, and your heart is beating and you have a human brain, there's a divine quality within you, and that nobody's excluded, and that everybody has the same birthright to create a destiny for themselves. So the movie was a great beginning because it gave people the opportunity to give themselves, for the first time, permission to see themselves as special, to see themselves as unique, and at the same time give you enough knowledge and enough information to begin to apply those principles to your life. Not just to sit around and have a good dinner conversation, but actually get about applying the principles to see measurable results in your life. That's what it's about. Because then you get to be the scientist in your own life. You get to map how your thoughts create your own future. You get to look to see how your repetitive thinking and your repetitive reacting is producing the same conditions in your life. You know, the same relationships, the same job, the same circumstances, and nothing new happening. But that's the human condition that we live by. So let's talk a little bit about science here, because I want everybody to begin to think along the same lines today, because we're going to cover a lot of material geniuses very quickly, okay? Because you got a lot of things to create, right? So science back in the 1700s there wasn't a whole lot of science back then. There was more conjecture, and there was more church and religion. And so people lived by ignorance and superstition. And along came René Descartes. You heard of that guy? Back in the 1700s, he's sitting by a fountain one day, and he says, I got to sort this out, because there's really two spheres of understanding. There's this objective world of large objects and things in nature, planets, and everything falls under predictable laws. And that's repeatable, and that's scientific. But then there's this whole thing of the human mind. And, the human mind's way too subjective. It's unpredictable. There's no science to back it. And so I want to still do my experiments, is what he's saying to himself. I want to continue doing my scientific research. But I don't want to be bombarded or bothered by the church and the doctrines. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to divide everything that's objective and scientific and repeatable into one area. And I'm going to call that the sphere of science. And all this stuff about the mind, we're going to just give that to religion. So he created this unique division. It's called Cartesian dualism. And really what he was doing is he was giving himself permission to do what he wanted to do, because he was interested in getting cadavers from the church to do scientific experiments. So he performed this intellectual sleight of hand so that he could do what he wanted to do. And Descartes really began this concept of classical physics. 100 years later, Isaac Newton shows up, right? You know what Isaac Newton says? He says, I can prove everything that Descartes said scientifically. There's constants in the universe, like gravity and force, and there's acceleration. And I can produce the mathematical equations that are going to give the Cartesian dualism foundation. And because of Newton, we can shoot a rocket to the moon, and we can figure out distance and time and space. And so Newton then put the screws in to what's called classical physics or Newtonian physics. Things that are repeatable, large objects moving in space. An apple falls from the tree. As long as we know the distance of how far it falls, we can calculate the speed and everything else. 100 years later, who shows up next? Einstein, right? Now, Einstein, he was a scientist, but he worked in a third-rate patent office in Switzerland. And he was a visionary. And he asked himself this question when he was a young child, 12 years old. He said, if I ride my bicycle at the speed of light and I turn my headlights on, will they go on? And then he said, if I was God, this is what he asked himself. If I was God, how would I create a universe? How would I do it? This is a 12-year-old kid asking these questions. And he thought about those questions every single day of his life. And he used to go out on this lake, and he'd lay on his back in a boat. And he would just float out there, and he'd begin to create this model of understanding. And if he didn't like the model, he'd stop and he'd rebuild it again. He thought about it every day. He wasn't thinking about his relationship or his hair or what he looked like. But he was thinking about relativity. So 10 years later, as he's working as a clerk in a Swiss patent office, he begins to have these visions, these abstract visions. And the visions were so nonlinear that he had to go back to school to learn the mathematics to be able to explain what he was seeing. And when he published his first paper on electromagnetics, he had no footnotes. And that rocked the scientific community because you always reference somebody, right? So they said, where is this guy getting all this information? 3 months later, he produces the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. And for the first time, somebody united energy and matter. Because he could explain how energy turns into matter and that the speed of light is the ceiling in this universe. And nothing can travel faster than it. And that relativity gives us these constants of gravity. And that gravity changes with relativity. And he created this whole new understanding. Well, after that, it began to break down the theories of what Newton and Descartes created. And Einstein and Planck began shooting these high-energy beams into very solid structures of metals. And what they were doing is they were shoving all this strong energy into these plates to disturb the electrons to see what happened when those electrons released energy. So this is simple stuff. Now, Geniuses. It is. So, remember when I talked about the apple falling from the tree with Newton? Here's a small little body, here's a big Earth, and if you drop a small piece of matter towards a large body, it always falls towards the large body. That's gravity. So now that apple falls very smooth and continuous, right? You drop it and it falls at a constant speed, or it accelerates. Well, they were expecting electrons to do the same thing. They were expecting electrons, when they released energy, to move towards the nucleus of the atom. But you know what happened? Didn't work. As a matter of fact, what happened was the electron absorbed all this energy, and then it released it. And then absorbed more energy and released it. And instead of like a smooth and continuous thing, like a ball rolling down a hill, it looked like the energy of electrons gained energy and lost it. Gained it and lost it. It looked like a ball rolling downstairs. Now, all of a sudden, the very large world of Newtonian physics became very different than the very small world of subatomic particles. And that wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be the same game. So then they started to look for an electron, and guess what happened? Everywhere they looked for it, it appeared. It was as if the electron was responding to the mind of the observer. And the measurements that they were making on the electrons just automatically produced, gratified, said, sure, we'll show up exactly where you want us to. And we'll do exactly what you want us to do. And now all of a sudden, for the first time, this concept of matter and mind started to merge. Now, dualism started to break down because mind now had an effect on the nature of reality. That observation, the observer, and it didn't matter who was doing the experiment. Anybody, male, female, black, white, tall, short, smart, intellectual, average, bus driver, didn't matter. That if they observed the electron, it appeared exactly where they expected it to. And so matter and mind began to merge for the first time. And this wacky world of quantum physics was born. Now, quantum physics basically says that mind is a participant in science. It says you can't have an experiment without having a mind present. Now, when I talk to quantum physicists about this over the last 2 years, they always say to me, Joe, that's really great. We know that the observer has an effect on the nature of reality. And we know that the observer has to be a participant in the experiments. But, that only works for the very tiny. It only works for subatomic particles. It doesn't work for the very large. And I always say the same thing to them. Maybe we're just poor observers. Maybe we can get better at observation. Maybe we can train the mind and the brain to work better. And if we can improve our skill of observation, maybe we'll have more of an effect on the very large. You guys buy that at any degree? Think that's possible? You think you can change your brain and your mind and make it work better? Think you can do that? Last 2 Novembers ago, in the Journal of the Proceedings of Neuroscience in 2004, there was an article that was written by a group of scientists from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And what these guys wanted to do is they wanted to see if people could train their brains and train their mind and make their brains and mind work better. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to do an experiment where they taught people to focus on a single-minded thought, one thought, for an extended period of time. They were going to compare it to a control group. So they said, well, what group of people really focus on single-minded thoughts for long periods of time? And you're exactly right. And I noticed there aren't a lot of men here. Oh, ask me about that later. And so, Dr. Davidson was one of the scientists. He said, you know what? I'm going to call up these group of men that could focus on single-minded thoughts. So he called the Buddhist monks. He called the Dalai Lama. And he said, hey, listen, send your 8 greatest guys down here. I want to do an experiment with them. So now these guys had over 50,000 hours of focused meditation on thoughts like compassion, love, divinity. And they meditated for close to 40 years, some of them 50 years. They had 8 subjects. And then they took a group of people that were like the average cat, And they said, we're going to teach you how to focus. We're going to teach you how to meditate on a single-minded thought. And you got a week to do this, okay? So every day they would take the monks, and the monks would teach these people how to focus on one thought, like divinity or compassion. And so they took the monks and they hooked up 256 electrodes to their scalp. Can you guys picture this? Those monks with the bald heads? You know, these electrodes all over them. And they said, okay, now be your normal monk self. Now listen, we want you to close your eyes. We want you to focus on compassion. Now the moment that these guys did that, part of the brain called the frontal lobe lit up. And it lit up to a degree that the neuroscientists had never seen activity in the frontal lobe like that before. Those guys locked into the thought, and they were able to hold that thought in their mind for an extended period of time. They went over to the control group, and they said, okay, you guys, focus on compassion. Guess what happened? They were saying, well, what the hell's compassion anyway? What is it? My back hurts. I got to pick up my daughter from ballet. How long are we going to do this for? I'm tired. Can I get a drink of water? And the activity in the frontal lobe of the monks seemed to coordinate the rest of the brain to work as a perfect symphony. And the brain waves that they were capturing in the monks were called gamma band rays. And those waves in the gamma band are the exact waves that the brain uses to make new circuits and new connections. And at the same time, it's the exact waves that are produced in the brain when you're in the zone, when you're in the flow. And the erratic activity of the control group didn't even come close to that. They were still somewhere in alpha, thinking, in beta, struggling. And in one monk, he had such activity in the left side of his frontal lobe, which is called the happy spot in neuroscience. He had such activity in that left frontal lobe, they said, he's got to be the happiest guy in the world. I mean, it was that dramatic. Now, the frontal lobe, by the way, is the crowning achievement of human beings. It's what separates us from all other species. It's not the fact that we have opposing thumbs, that we stand on 2 feet, or we have little body hair, that our eyes point straight ahead, or that we have big brains, because elephants have bigger brains than us. What separates us from every other species on the planet is the size of the frontal lobe in reference to the rest of the brain. Now, the frontal lobe makes up about 40% of the human brain. The next closest ancestors, chimpanzees, gibbons, about 17%, somewhere between 15 and 17%. Dogs, about 7%. You cat lovers, 3.5%. That's it. Now, the frontal lobe does this amazing thing in human beings. It allows us to make thought more real than anything else. That's the privilege of being a human being. That's the privilege. Because of its enormous size, it allows us to learn from our experiences, to modify our behaviors, and produce a different outcome. Not keep forcing the square peg into the round hole. In the frontal lobe, if we were to use one word to describe the frontal lobe, we would use the word purpose or intent. It modifies our behavior. It allows us to plan for the future. It controls our impulses. And when our actions are aligned with our thoughts, and when our intentions and our behaviors are equal, it's when the frontal lobe is turned on. Now, most people have an intention, but their actions are contrary to their intention. But when those two things are aligned, it's when the frontal lobe is when it's in its full force. Now, when they looked at these Buddhist monks, they said, maybe you could make the brain work better, just like if you practice, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice, the better you got. And that maybe we can make the brain and the mind work better just with practice. Now, when I read that article in the Proceedings of Neuroscience, when I finished it, I thought, now, wait a second here. Let's think about this. The brain is the organ where there's the greatest number of neurons, right? Geniuses, right? Where there's the greatest number of neurons, we have the greatest intelligence. We have the greatest ability to learn. Neurons clustered together is what makes this concept called mind. Now, what's mind? Mind is the brain in action. Mind is the brain at work. Mind is the brain turned on. Now, when they were doing those functional brain scans on those monks, and they were measuring their mind, their brain in action, they said, these guys are making the brain and the mind work better. So here's what I thought when I read the article. I said, okay, that sounds good. So the brain has all these neurons. That's the organ of intelligence. I've dissected enough cadavers to know that it's an organ just like a liver or pancreas or anything else. When there's no life, it's just an organ. And I know that the mind is the brain in action or the brain at work. So then who's changing the brain and the mind? The brain can't change the brain, right? And the mind can't change the brain because the mind is the product of the brain. So who's doing the changing? And it's that nasty 13-letter word called consciousness, you and me. That we are the occupier of the body and the brain. And that when we're totally conscious and we're totally aware, that's when we have the ability to alter the way the brain and the mind works. Now, most of our living day, geniuses, we live in a response to the external world. In other words, all of our senses are responding to everything we're seeing, tasting, feeling, touching, and hearing. And the environment is causing us to think in certain ways. And the environment turns on the circuits in our brain. We could only think equal to our environment. Did you hear me? Yes. You know what that means? It means if you believe to the slightest degree, at the smallest degree, that your thoughts have an effect on reality, if you accept that to the smallest degree, and if we're centrally experiencing our daily lives every day, and we're reacting to the inputs in our life, it means our reality will always be equal to the way we think and react. We could never have anything new happen because our environment is causing us to think. So nothing new happens. Are you with me? So then, how do we change that? How do we begin to make the difference? How do we do it? Because the quantum law still applies. If you're allowing your environment and the stimulation in your environment to turn on different brain circuits, and those brain circuits are like automatic programs that run all the time. As soon as you see someone who fires a thought in your brain, the next thing you know, you run through these series of thoughts. And it's as if you're asleep. And what we know from neuroscience is that once the brain turns on an automatic program, it takes very little effort for the brain to run from that point on. So we live most of our waking day asleep, responding to the environment and allowing the environment to turn on circuits. Now, over the last 7 years, I've been very interested in this concept called spontaneous remissions. People who have had healings from different diseases, whether it was cancer or diabetes or lung conditions, or gum conditions or depression, heart disease, high cholesterol, arrhythmias, people who even had rare genetic disorders that medical science had no solution for. And I found out that there were 4 things in common amongst every person that had a remission from a disease. And I asked these people a lot of questions. Now, these weren't people that just, got better from a cold. These were people who had dramatic changes, and there were objective tests that studied their condition before, and then afterwards, when they did that test again, that same test that was an objective test, all of a sudden had a measurable change. Now, if something happens once in science, there's some cause to produce some effect, or there's an effect that's created. In science, it's called an incident. First time it happens, like there was an incident, someone was healed of cancer. Now, if it happens twice, 2 seemingly unrelated events happen simultaneously or close together, what do we call that? A coincidence, right? Or wasn't that a coincidence? 2 people were healed. Now, when it begins to happen 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times, now it's starting to get repeatable, right? And anything that's repeatable, there should be some scientific law to prove it. In other words, there's some cause producing an effect. And so I was interested in seeing if there were some things that were in common that had some cause to produce an effect in these people's lives and produce measurable changes in their health. So the first thing that was common amongst everybody that had a spontaneous remission is that every single person believed and accepted that there was some divine element within them that was giving them life. Now, you may call that spiritual or consciousness, or you may call it divine or divinity, or whatever you want to call it, innate intelligence, that there was something giving them life. Now, there's nothing mystical about this intelligence. It's the same intelligence that's keeping your heart beating right now without you consciously thinking about it. Your heart beats over 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons of blood an hour, over 100,000 gallons of blood a day, through 60,000 miles of blood vessels. And your blood vessels only weigh 3% of your body weight. You thinking about keeping that heart going? Or is there an intelligence doing that for you? That same intelligence is filtering liters of blood and turning it into waste. The greatest kidney dialysis machines filter about 10% of your blood per hour. And it's digesting your food and breaking it down into gases and nutrients. That same intelligence, by the way, is responsible for making about 10 million cells every second. And you lose 10 million cells every second. Now, are you thinking about making those 10 million cells? Or is there an order and intelligence doing it for you? It's that same intelligence right now that's producing 100,000 chemical reactions per cell in the 70 to 100 trillion cells that make up your body. 100,000 chemical reactions per second per cell in 100 trillion cells. So we are a work in progress. Would you agree? Now, these people, they said, something's giving me life. Something knows how to do this much better than I do. And if I could just make contact with this mind, if I could just surrender to this mind and give it instructions and then get out of the way, it should be able to heal this for me, because I'm certainly not going to do it. But it knows how to do it. You guys accept that? Yes. So they set out with this premise that this mind was much greater than their thinking mind. And that they humbled themselves to the idea of giving themselves and their condition to this greater mind. You know, thy will be done. Now, the second thing they had in common is that they accepted the idea that their thinking or their thoughts or their reactions or their attitudes is what created their condition. They said, it was my 20 years of anger or my 10 years of hating my mother or my 15 years of living in suppressed emotions because I didn't like my boss and never expressed it. I was hurting myself with my own thoughts. Now, do you know that every time you have a thought, you make a chemical? And if you have happy thoughts or unlimited thoughts or joyful thoughts, you make chemicals in a matter of seconds that make you feel happy, unlimited, and joyful. And if you have insecure thoughts or hateful thoughts or angry thoughts, in a matter of seconds, your brain releases chemicals, and you begin to feel angry or hateful or insecure. So the thought then turns into a chemical in a matter of seconds. Now here's the bad news. The moment we have a thought and it makes us feel a certain way, the brain turns on the chemicals and it turns on the body, and the body begins to feel a certain way. And the moment we start to feel a certain way, we start to think the way we're feeling, which then makes more chemicals to make us feel the way we're thinking, which then makes us feel the way we're thinking and think the way we're feeling, until feelings become the means of thinking. And when feelings become the means of thinking, we are now in what's called a state of being. So imagine, you have a thought, any thought. Have a thought. Doesn't matter. You could have a happy thought. You could have an insecure thought. You can have an unworthy thought. You could have an angry thought. You can have a joyful thought, an inspired thought. You can have a thought of, I can't, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy. In a matter of seconds, your brain just made chemicals. And your adrenal glands and your pancreas started releasing enzymes. Your brain surged with electrical activity and produced a mob of neurochemicals, too numerous to name at this point. Your liver started making enzymes that weren't there before. Blood flow to your hands and feet changed. Your respiratory rate changed. Your heart rate changed, all from thinking one thought. You're that powerful. Now, whether we like it or not, the moment we have a thought, seems like the rest is history, right? Because the moment that thought happens, the cascade of chemical reactions happens behind the scenes of our awareness. And before you know it, we begin to feel a certain way. And we call that who we are. I am sad. I am unworthy. I am insecure. And we believe that that state of being defines us chemically. But the question is, if a thought makes a chemical and it makes us feel certain ways, and we begin to think the way we're feeling because we're feeling a certain way, who's doing the thinking? Are we thinking, or is the body instructing us to think? Which is it? It's the body instructing us to think. And when the body instructs us to think, mind now, which should sit in the brain, is now sitting in the body. And when that happens, we are an unbridled horse. We are living in reaction and responses instead of intentional actions and choices. So these people said, I got to break the habit of being myself. I can't be this person any longer because it's killing me. So which brings me to the third thing. They said, I have to reinvent myself. I can't be the same person. I got to become somebody different. I can't be the same exact person because it's what's got me in trouble. So they began to ask themselves some very important questions. Questions like this that we don't normally ask ourselves. What would it be like to be a happy person? Who do I know in my life that's happy and joyful? Who in history do I admire that was great, that had great virtue? What do I not like about myself? And what do I do every day that makes me feel this way? What are my thoughts that make me feel the way I feel? And where do I get stuck? And when do I fall from grace? And as they began to ask themselves those questions, the what-if kinds of questions, guess what part of the brain turned on? Frontal lobe. All of a sudden it woke up and it said, oh my God, she's thinking. Instead of reacting. Now listen, as they began to ask themselves these questions, the brain, 100 billion neurons, and the programs that run in there, all of a sudden stopped. And the frontal lobe is like a symphony leader. It started to gather different bits of information and shuffle this information to cause these neurons to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. It started to interrupt the programs, and the frontal lobe started gathering all the data of the brain and coming up with this ideal of who they wanted to become. They said, what is the greatest ideal of myself, and could I live as that ideal? Now listen, do you think that you can change your brain just by thinking about it? You think you can do that? So listen, they did this experiment a few years back. They took these people and they separated them into 4 different categories. And none of these people knew how to play the piano. They said, we're going to do a functional brain scan of you before you learn how to play the piano and after. And we're going to see if you grow any brain circuits by us running through this experiment with you. Now, functional brain scans are like a motion picture. You can study the brain over time. You can study the brain in action. Before functional brain scans were created 35 years ago, it was like taking a snapshot of the brain. You took a snapshot and said, well, there's no tumor in there, or there's no genetic problems, or there's not a stroke. But we were looking at static structures. With a brain scan, you can see the brain in action. That studies mind, right? So they said to the first group of people, listen, this is what we're going to do. We're going to scan your brains before. We're going to scan them after. We want you to do 1-finger exercises, scales and chords on the piano. We're going to teach them to you. You come every day and practice for 2 hours a day for 5 days, and then we're going to check your brain again afterwards. So the first group of people, they scanned their brains before. They came every day. They scanned their brains after. And at the end of 5 days, after they played the 1-hand finger exercises, guess what happened? A whole area on the opposite side of the brain began to fire. They grew new circuits. And wouldn't that make sense? If you learn something and you apply what you learn, you cause the brain to activate in new ways, and your brain starts connecting new circuits and wiring together. That's the Hebbian principle called nerve cells that fire together, wire together. So if you do an action and you repeat it, and you learn something and you apply what you learn, expect to have your brain change. That's simple neuroscience. So the second group of people, they said, listen, we're going to scan your brains before, we're going to scan your brains after. We want you to come for 2 hours a day for 5 days, but listen, we're not going to teach any chords or any scales. Just come and play whatever you want. Do whatever you want. So at the end of 5 days, they rescanned their brains, and guess what happened? Very little. You know why? They didn't learn anything. They didn't apply what they learned. They didn't repeat it. And they couldn't remember what they did the day before. So they were playing different things every day. And, of course, they had a little activity, but not much. So they said to the third group of people, don't even show up. And guess what happened to them? Same person. You listening? They never rehearsed. Now, the last group of people, they said, listen, come for 2 hours a day, come for 5 days. We'll scan your brains before, we'll scan your brains after. We're going to teach you these 1-handed finger exercises, but listen, we don't want you to physically play them. We want you to close your eyes and mentally rehearse playing the scales and chords. We're going to keep you awake. We'll nudge you with a broomstick. But you're going to do it for 2 hours a day for 5 days, and we're going to scan your brain at the end. And guess what happened after 5 days? They grew the same circuits in their brain as the people who physically rehearsed. Now, the scientists said, you know what? That means they changed their brain just by thinking about it. And the brain didn't know the difference between physical rehearsal and mental rehearsal. So now here's the question, geniuses. What are you mentally rehearsing all day long? What are you physically demonstrating all day long? And what level of mind do you live by? Because nerve cells that fire together wire together. So every day you're thinking thoughts of suffering, insecurity, unworthiness. Just like those piano players, you're causing those circuits to become more hardwired. And then if you can demonstrate it, someone says, how are you doing? You say, oh my God, let me tell you how bad I'm suffering. Now you get to demonstrate what you've just rehearsed for the last 2 hours. And those people said, I have to create a new way of being. And they began to rehearse in their mind, causing those neurons to fire in new patterns and combinations. And those new patterns and combinations, it started to get easier because they could remember who they wanted to be from the day before. Now you may say, well, that's great. You know, you can change the brain and grow new circuits, Joe, and that's really good theoretically. But that doesn't really have any effect on the body. So scientists did another experiment. They took people and they said, look, we want you to strengthen one finger. We're going to give you this little spring, and you're going to hook your finger behind the spring, and you're going to pull the spring every day for an hour. Now, wouldn't that make sense? If you're using a muscle, those muscles are going to get stronger just by pure physiology. So they had these people do it for 5 days, for an hour a day. At the end of the experiment, they retested that finger after they had the exercises, and at the beginning they had a certain strength, and at the end their strength was greater by 30%. That makes sense, right? If you use it, it gets better. So they took a group of control people and they said, listen, we want you to rehearse pulling that spring for an hour a day for 5 days. At the end of the experiment, never touching the spring, those people who mentally rehearsed had a 22% increase in the strength of their finger without ever doing any activity. You couch potatoes. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm joking.
My name is Liz Dawn, and I'm with Celebrate Your Life Events. And the presentation that you've been listening to was recorded live at one of our Celebrate Your Life conferences. And this program was created exclusively for Evan's audience. And I'm super thrilled to share this information with you. So come check us out. Take a look at all of our retreats and programs and conferences that we have to offer. Click the link below, and hopefully I'll see you in person. All right, now let's get back to the presentation.
So what does that mean? What it means is this. It means that nerve cells that fire together not only wire together, but when those nerve cells wire together, the more we place mind or attention on any one thing, and those nerve cells keep firing, not only do they develop stronger connections, but they make more intricate, detailed tributaries and finer connections. And those people who rehearsed by mind alone created the circuits of strength in their brain that were reflected in their physical body. So these people who mentally rehearsed, just like the piano players, they began to say, you know what? I'm starting to feel a little differently here. I'm starting to feel like a different person. I'm not feeling like that same person every day. And what they were doing every day when they rehearsed is they were warming up the circuits in their brain so that that would be the platform from where they would begin their day instead of the old person that they were. Now, the fourth thing they had in common is that they made it the most important thing to themselves. And they gave up their social engagements and their dinners and their phone talks and, you know, their television shows and all that stuff. And they made it the most important thing to themselves. And in the process of rehearsal, they had long moments where they lost track of time and space. In other words, they were so involved with their creation. They had fallen in love with what they were doing so much that when they opened their eyes or turned on the light in the room, they expected it to be like 15 minutes later. And it was like an hour and 20 minutes later. It's not like time, you know, when they looked back at time, they didn't realize that it was going slow. It was just that there was no time. They didn't have any time. Now, the brain processes 400 billion bits of information every second. You know that? I said it in the movie. Geniuses. But we're only aware of 2,000 of those 400 billion bits. And those 2,000 bits of information that you and I are aware of the majority of the time is, guess what? 3 things. The body, the environment, and time. That's it. Out of the 400 billion bits of quantum information that your brain is processing, you and I are keeping our attention and our awareness on the body, the environment, and time. Does your back hurt? Is it too cold in here? Are you tired? Are you hungry? Do you have a headache? Do you like the way the person smells sitting next to you? How long is he going to talk? Are we going to get a break soon? All those things. That's where we're occupying mind. Now, when the frontal lobe can make the thought more real than anything else, the frontal lobe is the volume control of the brain. And the frontal lobe can lower the volume to the external world. It lowers the volume to your body. It lowers the volume of time. And the brain circuits that are preoccupied with feeling and moving and emotions and seeing, all the circuits cool off. The frontal lobe is a symphony leader, and he just goes like this. And when it cools off all those circuits and there's no longer any activity there, there is no mind there. And if there is no mind in the circuits that are processing feeling and moving, and there's no mind that's processing emotions, then the sense of self disappears. And the only thing that's real in that moment is the thought. And when the thought becomes the only thing that's real, that's the moment the brain doesn't know the difference between the internal world and the external world. And that's the moment the brain maps that thought and pattern right in the neurological tissue. And that's how the brain begins to change. So these people, in the process of rehearsal, were so absorbed in what they were doing that they forgot about themselves. They forgot about their bodies. They forgot about their problems. They forgot about their disease. They forgot about their conditions. They forgot about their relationships. They forgot about their finances. All of that stuff disappeared because when they enacted the frontal lobe properly, the frontal lobe grabbed different circuits and combined a new model, a new ideal. And then it cooled off all the other circuits that were distracted, that was the result of reactions to the environment, so that the only thing that was real was thought in that moment. And when that happened, the frontal lobe tracked that stream of consciousness and then laid a pattern of neurological circuits. And the more they did it every day, the easier it was for them to be that person. And a period of time went by, which is one of the minor things that happened, is that when they were healed, they absolutely knew it. It wasn't like, oh, geez, I hope my diabetes is gone, or I hope this is better. It wasn't like that. They said, something changed, I'm better. I'm feeling better, and something's changed. Now, the other thing they had in common was that most of the doctors thought that they were crazy, which is understandable, right? Sure it is. And yet, a miracle, anytime a miracle happens, you have to go against convention, right? So you're going to be considered crazy anyway. But the doctors, after a period of time, all said the same thing. I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it, because it's working. So now, let's just talk about this concept of the brain and the mind. When the sperm and the egg come together, geniuses, the moment that the sperm and the egg come together, there's a swap of genetic information. There's genetics from the mother and the father that come together and combine and form a new human being. And right around the first month of life, cells start differentiating and you start making neurons or brain cells. And you make about 8,000 of those per minute in your first month of life in utero. By the third month of life, you're making about 250,000 neurons per minute. When you get to the last trimester, your 8th and 9th month, the brain is busy differentiating. And what it's doing is it's growing these branches. These neurons are growing these long branches. And what those neurons are doing is they're reaching out and touching other neurons. Now, the moment those neurons touch other neurons, the brain is making about 2 million nerve connections per second. And that continues all the way to the time you're 2 years old. So the brain is busy making circuits and connections. And every place, geniuses, where one neuron touches another neuron, that's called a thought or a memory. So you come into life preloaded with a lot of memories, because the brain is an artifact of generations gone by. The brain is an artifact of other thoughts and other memories that have been stored in it, and when you're born, you're giving a certain platform, a beginning stage to begin your life. Are you with me? So all those circuits and connections are your ancestors' memories and thoughts and experiences. Now, they used to say the brain is hardwired, meaning you're born with a certain amount of circuits, and, good luck, you're going to turn out like your parents. End of the story. That's what they said. And now neuroscience is saying we lied. That's not true. that you are born with a certain amount of hardwired circuits that are predetermined genetically. But that's only 50% of who you are. The other 50% is a blank slate where you get to write your own inscriptions and encodings in your brain. See, if the history of the brain was different today, the history of the species would be different as well. So we have certain compartments and certain regions of the brain that are similar to other animals, our survival mechanisms, because they've been there for millions and millions of years. And yet we have certain areas of our brain that's moldable and changeable. And we have long-term genetic traits that have to do with facial expressions when you're sad or you're happy, and movements and the way our body's wired based on our structure. Those are pretty much long-term traits that have been pretty much hardwired over generations. But now the short-term traits have to do with what you inherited from your parents. And what you inherit from your parents is what they've mastered. That's it. So if your mother is a master at suffering, guess what? If your father is the master of anger and temper tantrums, if they've mastered that, that's the hardwired circuits that you get. If you get your mother's creativity and your father's intellect, or your mother's insecurity and your father's rage. Whatever they rehearsed mentally and could physically demonstrate at will are the circuits that you're given as the beginning stages of your life. And those are the tendencies and propensities that give rise to who we are. Now, don't you find it interesting that you're raised by the same people that give you the same circuits? Which means then, if we're going to look at the concept of nature and nurture, then the environment, which adds to the way our brain is shaped and molded, we're placed in the environment raised by the same people with the same circuits. So it looks like it's a very, very slim chance to make our way out of this. And if we're not learning anything new, and if we're not out there changing our brain, we're going to think the same thoughts as our parents, feel the same way as our parents, act the same way as our parents, more than 50% of the time. But there's two ways, geniuses, you can change the brain. The two ways are, every time you learn something new, you learn knowledge, you learn facts, you learn information, you learn philosophy, you learn what's called semantics. Every time you learn something new, guess what happens in your brain? You make a new connection. Every time you learn something new, you make a new connection. Learning is making synaptic connections in the brain. Remembering is maintaining or sustaining those connections, keeping them connected, and causing those neurons to develop a long-term relationship. So I can give you a book on how to read a bicycle, and you can read all the information, and then I can give you a test, and you can memorize that material. And when I give you that test, when you start reading those questions, it's going to activate circuits that you made, and you're going to be able to reproduce what you learned. That's knowledge, right? But the second way we make connections, which is the enriched way, is from experience. Experience shapes the brain. Now, when we experience something, everything we're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, all of our five senses are gathering information from the environment and sending a rush of information back to the brain, and it's causing neurons to sting into place. And when those neurons sting into place, they release chemicals. And those chemicals then that are released from those neurons patterning are what's called feelings or emotions. Emotions and feelings are the end product of an experience. So we feel a certain way after an experience. Remember where you were on 9/11? You can remember where you were because you remember how you felt. Remember your first kiss? All those things have to do with the feeling that's associated with it. So our feelings and our emotions are the end product of experiences. Now, geniuses, think about this. When we then get on the bike and ride the bike, and we fall and skin our knee, we get back on and we pedal up a hill and we feel the pain in our legs. And then we ride down the hill and we feel the wind blowing through our hair and tears running off the side of our face. And the chain falls off, and we get off the bike and we change the chain, and then we wipe our face and we smell the grease under our nose. All of that sensory information from riding the bicycle, the experience of it is enriching us, isn't it? So experiences then are the end product of an experience, and that's what seals the deal. And the more knowledge we have, the more information we get, and the more we apply that knowledge, the better the experience. Wouldn't you agree? In other words, if I didn't give you the book on how to ride the bicycle, and you didn't see the Lance Armstrong video, and I didn't give you the 10 do's and don'ts, and you just got on the bike and you rode the bike, pretty rough day, right? But the more knowledge we have, the more prepared we are for the experience. And when we apply what we learn, step outside of philosophy and apply it, now we're on the stage to begin to set ourselves up for a new experience. Now, here's the question. How many new experiences have you had lately? How many new experiences have you had lately? And if you haven't had any new experiences lately, or if you haven't learned anything new and applied what you've learned to produce a new experience, guess which circuits you're using? You're going to say to your brother, "Did I just act like Dad right there? Did I just act like him?" Because we're only using the circuits then that have been given to us. The geniuses reason this with me. If we believe that thoughts have anything to do with our future, and we're living every single day based on feelings, and feelings are the end product of an experience, in the quantum world, if we're thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, tell me what we're creating more of. Same old, because the quantum law still applies. It still says your thoughts matter. But if feelings are our thoughts, or feelings are the means of thinking, then in the quantum world, feelings are the past. So we're creating more of what? And nothing new happens. But yet we're wired with the size of the frontal lobe to make thought more real than anything else. And we're wired to call on a supernatural power, and we do it all the time. But we only have to wait for the circumstances to get that bad in our life. You know what I mean? And then we're being desperate, asking for help, instead of being divine and asking for help. And so, what do we love about those heroes we go to movies to see? What do we love about them? You know what we love about them? Is that they said, I believe in a thought. I believe in an idea. I believe in a concept. And I'm uncompromising to this concept. I don't care what's happening to my body. I don't care what's happening in my environment. I don't care what the circumstances are. I don't care how long it takes. But I'm going to make this thought more real than anything else, and I'm going to live by it. I'm going to be uncompromising. And those are the individuals that we love in history. William Wallace, Martin Luther King, Elizabeth I, Gandhi. All those people said, I'm believing in a future I can't experience with my senses yet, but I've already mapped it in my mind. And I can't compromise what I know for anybody, anything, anytime. And when we have our thoughts and our intentions lined up like that, when we have our actions and our intentions match, that's when we start calling on supernatural power to begin to intervene in our lives. You can't be a suffering person and rehearse from suffering. You have to be that person who you're going to fall into becoming, who you're going to fall in love with. And that state of mind, then, is the state of mind of a new being observing a new outcome. Too many times we live our lives surrendering to the circumstances instead of seeing the circumstances as an opportunity to match our mind. When we allow ourselves that degree of understanding, that's when we begin this journey. And the journey is something very simple. Your reality is your life. And your life is a reflection of how we think. And if we're going to change our life, we have to change the way we think. I'll take some questions now. Yeah.
Okay. If you have a thought, and the thought's not pleasant, but then you realize that you don't want that thought, and you say, cancel, or how long does the thought, how can you get rid of the thought? If you realize that you don't want that thought.
Okay,
I'm expressing it right?
Okay, so we have two types of memory. So memory is derived from what? Learning, right? If you repeat what you learn over and over again, you develop a memory. Now, there's two types of memories. There's what's called declarative memories. Science calls them explicit memories. But just think of memories that are declarative are memories that you can declare. And there's two types of declarative memories. There's knowledge, which is facts, semantic memory, and that takes place in the thinking brain. That's the big neocortex. And then there's experiences, which are events, episodic memories. Thinking and feeling brain is involved in experiences. I know that I'm a man. I know that I know a few things about spinal biomechanics. I know that I like garlic mashed potatoes. I know my chemistry teacher had thick eyebrows. I know these things. I know that we pay taxes on April 15th. These are memories that I can declare, right? Now, there's a second set of memories called non-declarative memories. These are called implicit memories or called procedural memories. And they're the memories that are related to skills and habits, behaviors, emotional reactions, associative memories, and that's more wired to a deeper subconscious brain called the cerebellum. Now, when we learn something new, that's called thinking. If we apply what we learn and we personalize it or we can demonstrate it, we're going to modify our behavior and we're going to create what's called doing. Doing is the experience from thinking. Now, it's not enough to just have one experience. You can't just say, oh, I did great today. I didn't feel like a victim today. You have to be able to repeat that experience. And when we can repeat it over and over again, if we can replicate it, that's called being. Being is being able to live it because you've done it so many times. And that's an example of anybody who's done anything great. And you say, how do you do that? And they say, I don't know, I've done it so many times, I don't have to think about it. Well, thinking about it is here. So learning is thinking, applying what we learn is doing, modifying our behavior until we create this state of being. And when we're being it now, it takes no effort at all. Most people have thought about who they are, they've demonstrated being that same person, and now they live as that person, and they try to change their life from that same state of being. You know, that's why like Alzheimer's people who have Alzheimer's, they lose their declarative memory. They say, I don't remember your name, I don't remember anything from my past, I can't declare who I am. But if you give them a pair of knitting needles, you know what happens, right? That's a skill, that's a habit. They've developed that. We want to create a new habit of being. We're just in the old habit of being. So what's neuroplasticity? It's a big word in science. Neuroplasticity means to fire a series of many diverse neural nets in different combinations. That is the thinking brain, this big yellow part. This is our crowning thinking brain that allows us to store memories, to learn and store memories, process sensory information from our environment. If we pull that away, this is the survival brain, the emotional brain, and then this is that automatic brain down at the bottom called the cerebellum. Neuroplasticity is a big word in science, geniuses, and it just means evolving ourselves. It means change. It's our brain's ability to change its synaptic wiring by learning information and by recording experiences and to maintain a modified state of being. Plasticity allows us to evolve our actions, modify our behavior, so that we can do a better job in life. Neurorigidity is using the brain's genetic, inherited, encoded synaptic connections, which are memories from our forefathers, without learning from new experiences. Rigidity is to process the same thoughts and perform the same actions and expect a different result. And that's the definition of insanity, huh? So neuroplasticity is upgrading or evolving the brain's hardware and software through a conscious interaction with the environment so that new systems can adapt to new demands. You get better at what you're doing. Neurorigidity is using the brain's same hardware and software by unconsciously processing the same data through different interactions in the environment. Does that make sense? Same old, same old. So plasticity is learning new things, creating new experiences, making new memories. When I lecture in Italy, you know, the Italians always say, what do you mean feelings are bad? And I say, well, feelings aren't bad. It's just if you keep having the same feelings. In the quantum field of potential, are there new experiences to have? And do those new experiences have new feelings and emotions? Okay, you're geniuses. Living life from past memories without learning new things and having new experiences is neurorigidity. We reach a certain point in our life and we just turn into rigid beings. The neuron is a nerve cell or a brain cell is the simplest functional unit of the nervous system. They possess the unique ability to store and communicate information between each other. So this is a neuron. In the neocortex, in your thinking brain, there's about 40,000 connections per neuron in your thinking brain. In a grain of sand, 1 grain of sand, there's over 100,000 neurons in a grain of sand. This is a three-dimensional view of what's called bipolar, unipolar, multipolar neurons here. Sorry, multipolar neurons. And they communicate in all different directions. You got 100 billion of them in your brain. If you took 100 billion sheets of paper and you stacked them on top of each other, it would go from Los Angeles to London. That's how big 100 billion is. So learning is making new synaptic connections. When you learn something new, you make a new synaptic connection. Did you make any new connections today? Yes. All right, here we go. So this is what it looks like. You're trying, you're listening. I kind of got it. I don't know what he's talking about. What is he saying? What's he talking about? I'm healthy. Now you're believing it. You're wired for it. Unhooking from your old self and becoming somebody else. That's real time, by the way, geniuses. So remembering is maintaining or sustaining those connections. So let's see what they look like. So that's when you're hardwired there. Neurons actually never really touch. There's really a space between them. They just look like they touch. But they're in constant communication. So this is what it looks like when you've wired something together and you've got a habit going, a pretty good one. And some habits are good, wouldn't you agree? There's plenty of automatic programs that we use every day. Driving a stick shift, brushing our teeth, doing the salsa, shaving your legs, whatever it is. Those are automatic things, right? 2 ways we make synaptic connections, okay? First one is called semantic memories, geniuses. That's learning information, that's knowledge, that's philosophy. Facts, I call it. Episodic memories, having novel experiences, embracing new events. And of course, if you're not learning anything new, and you're not having new experiences, you can guarantee you're headed for your genetic destiny. So Hebbian learning, nerve cells that fire together, wire together. When the bleep came out, everybody said, can I quote you on nerve cells that fire together, wire together? And I said, I didn't even say it. It's Dr. Donald Hebb was the first guy that said it. Which means then, when we learn by association, if I said a neuron looks like an oak tree, if I said it looks like an oak tree, but it's not like a big oak tree, it's got no leaves on it, it's like oak tree in the fall, and it's got branches going out in all directions and got tiny little finger-like twigs, and if you bring it together, it's got a big trunk, and if I pulled the tree out of the ground, it's got roots. That's what a neuron looks like, but they're not stiff like that. They're really tiny, and they look like cooked spaghetti. They're kind of wiry and alive. And I taught you something new about nerve cells. You know what I just did? I used what's already wired in your brain to make a new connection, right? I used what's already in there. I used oak tree, finger-like projections, twigs, tiny, leafless, fall, spaghetti, and I turned on different circuits in your brain so that once those circuits were turned on, we could make a new connection to the part of the brain that's alive. You got it? If I said receptor sites look like craters on the moon, but they're not stiff like craters, like flowers. They move and change. And then when a chemical fits into the receptor site, it fits in like a key into a lock, and it jiggles the cell like jello. And it sends an electrochemical response to the DNA, and the DNA unwinds like a zipper. Did I just tell you some things about cell physiology, and I used what's already wired in your brain to make a new circuit, a new connection? That's how we learn. So we're using the brain's stored information to learn new information, building new circuits from existing circuits, using what is familiar to understand what is unfamiliar, using old memories to form new memories, using knowns to understand unknowns, using synaptic connections to make new connections. Does that make sense? My computer guy, when he comes to do my computers, I got 12 computers now. I say, his name is Kirk. I go, Kirk, what happened? He goes, well, it's that, and he says all this stuff. I have no hardware in my brain to understand what he's saying. And you know what I always say to him, right? Did you fix it? But now that I have computers and I have to travel, I say, okay, now, Kirk, talk to me like the computer's a brain. Oh, this is your memory. Oh, I got that. Oh, this is your heart. Okay, all right, this is like the frontal lobe. Oh, okay. So I got to make them use what I know, right? Okay, now listen. These are the two laws of the brain that I talk about. Law of repetition, these are my words, but this is what I call it. Law of repetition is when you repeat a thought, an action, a skill over and over again, it becomes easy, familiar, common, natural, automatic, routine, effortless, second nature, subconscious, unconscious. You've done it so many times you have to think about it anymore. Now, every time we fire a thought in the brain and those neurons fire and they start to fire and wire, when they start to develop a long-term relationship, they release this chemical called nerve growth factor. Nerve growth factor is like the glue that causes neurons to stick together. And they cause not only the neurons to stick together, but it causes, it's like a miracle grow. It causes you to grow extra branches in there. Okay? So become more intricately wired. That's why a wine connoisseur, if I took a wine connoisseur and I set him next to the person who drinks the screw-off tops, and I said, hey, look at this wine. It's a Bordeaux, 86. And I go through the whole thing, and we let it breathe, and, you take the other person, sit them next to him, and they both drink the wine. Same wine, right? But the wine connoisseur, from repeated knowledge and instruction, repeated activity, paying attention to what they're learning, getting feedback, could pick up subtleties. Would you agree? And they could appreciate and enjoy the wine. And the guy who drinks the screw-off tops fires it down and goes, boy, I don't know, I like them both the same. Not wired to perceive the reality. You got it? So law of association is how we learn. Law of repetition is how we remember. If you keep thinking the same thoughts every day, are you hardwiring yourself to be more of the habit of yourself? So neural network or neural net, these are the big words in science, are just gangs of neurons that have fired and wired together to form a community of neurosynaptic connections that are related to a concept, an idea, a thought process, a memory, skill, behavior, and action. So neural nets, we have many different neural nets in our brain. Would you agree? Those are the automatic programs. Now here we go. Neural nets are formed by combining the law of association with the law of repetition. And when we do, we create a new level of mind. Do you have a new level of mind of neurons now? Hello? The reason you have a new level of mind for neurons is because I associated what they were with you, right? Used your brain, gave you the oak tree analogy. Now I've said it enough times that it's become familiar, right? So when I talk to you about neurons, do you have a new level of mind about them? That means you have a new neural net, right? Okay. They are the automatic hardwired programs that we unconsciously and automatically use every single day. So this is a slide of neurons that have a chemical stain on them, and you can see they look like spaghetti. Would you agree? If we took a cluster of neurons the size of a pea and we spread them out, it would be 2 miles long. That's what you got wrapped up between your ears there. Now, this is a slide that has a stain on it that picks up the electrical component. Watch, there's thought. Watch. There it goes. Your brain does that 400 billion times a second. Now watch. Lightning storm. Here we go. So cool. You generate more electrical impulses in your brain than all the cell phones on the planet put together. Geniuses. Just a question of what we're thinking about. So the brain is a central processing unit where there are the greatest number of nerve cells. Where there's the greatest number of neurons wired together, there's the greatest amount of intelligence, there's the highest ability to learn and the most memory storage. We've got a big data bank up there, right? When I talk tomorrow in my next talk, I'm going to do it all on what happens when we're under stress and what happens to the brain and why we can't think past how we feel. Because what we do is we make memory so real that the memory of the event creates the stress response just like we were actually experiencing the event. We're so good at it, aren't we? So mind is the brain in action, the brain at work, the product of the brain activity, what the brain does when the brain is animated with life. Therefore, we can produce many different levels of mind. Yes? 100 billion neurons, can you fire them in many different combinations? A few, wouldn't you think? To fire a series of many diverse neural nets in different combinations, sequences, and orders, and to produce a new level of mind and be able to repeat that same frame of mind at will, and to make it look natural and easy, that's when it's hardwired, right? So the frontal lobe is the seat of our free will, learning, intention, invention, attention, speculation, decision-making, behavior, control, and focus concentration. It restrains our impulsive emotional reactions. It's the newest and most evolved part of the human brain and the nervous system. It's the most neuroplastic part of the entire brain as well. It allows us to make thought more real than anything else. It connects to all other parts of the brain. And when it's in full operation, geniuses, it quiets down all the other circuits of the brain so nothing else is being processed but a single concept. It's the brain's symphony leader. It's the brain's volume control to the sensory and motor feedback from the body, our sensory awareness of the environment, and our concept of time. On functional scans, when they take monks or nuns and praying in reverie and they're totally into it, there's nothing going on in the rest of the brain. There's no mind there. A frontal lobe, now when we're examining new outcomes or when we're thinking about modifying our behavior, the frontal lobe can access all the diverse neural networks and combine them in different combinations, sequences, and orders to make a new level of mind and create new possibilities. It coordinates how the rest of the brain works. It's what changes the mind. The frontal lobe does. That's the seat of our free will. It reorganizes how we process the data bank of stored knowledge and experiences, and it seamlessly pieces them together in a nonlinear way to make a new plan. This is the process of meditation or contemplation. Contemplation is asking the what-ifs. What would it be like? What would I have to do? What would I have to be? What would I have to change about myself? What is my highest ideal? What do I want? These type of questions interrupt the program, interrupt the normal program. Through this process, the frontal lobe causes the brain to begin to fire in new ways by gathering all of its stored information to reconstruct or reinvent a new level of self. Mental rehearsal, right? It's concepting ourselves practicing this new idea, just like the piano players. Remembering what we want to demonstrate, thinking about what we want to become, learning and memorizing a new idea until it becomes familiar, continuously producing the same level of mind at will. cognitively experiencing what would it be like physically doing it. It must be done daily in consistency for new circuits to form, right? So Hebbian learning revisited. Guess what? Nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. That means when you start interrupting the program, where are you that asked the question? I want you to pay attention now. When you no longer fire those thoughts, the first step you have to become aware of what those thoughts are. Would you agree? Because they're automatic, right? You're out of the equation. That's why you can wash the dishes and tell your sister off and not think twice about it, right? So this is the true biology of change. Here we go. This is a neuron that's running to the body, okay? These are all the other neurons coming from all the other neural nets in your brain. And you decide now that you're going to want to become healthier or feel better, overcome your health condition. See this blue little neuron right here, geniuses? That's your new thought. I want to be healthy, right? But look at all this other chatter going on here. So here you go. I'm going to get up and think about being healthy. I'm going to rehearse being healthy. So the moment you say, I'm healthy, right? You fire that first thought, guess what happens? Well, you got all these other thoughts going on. You're not healthy. Give it up. Remember what the doctor told you? Your father had the same condition. You're doomed. So you got all this chatter going on at the same time, but you're trying to fire a new thought called health, right? But you got too many other thoughts going on at the same time. Guess what that chemical is right there? That's nerve growth factor. So you got this thought trying to come in of health, but, this is your back pain, and this is what the doctor told you, and you remember your dad having it, and this is your unworthiness, and all this stuff's going on at the same time. But you're firing the thought of health, firing it over and over again. And what part of the brain are you using to do that? So all of a sudden, by your will and your intent, you say, gosh, darn it, I want to make this the most important thought. And as you keep doing it over and over again, those neurons start developing a long-term relationship. You keep firing the same thought. Come on. Firing the same thought. Oh, look what happened. Strongest signal to the neuron now. It's the strongest signal to this neuron. It's overriding these other neural nets. Now watch what happens. Because this is the strongest signal, guess what chemical is going to start to be used? And nerve growth factor, guess what? There's only a certain amount in the brain. So we know what it's going to do? It's going to steal it from these other circuits. And they're memories, right? Aren't these neurons connected, just memories? So here's your strongest circuit. Oh, there goes your pain. There goes what the doctor told you. There goes your memory of the condition. Now, the only signal you're firing to your body is total health. That make sense? Okay, that's the biology of change. So, here it is. Can we believe in a future that we cannot see or experience with our senses, but already is mapped in our mind? Our senses and feelings should be the last to experience what the mind has created. To live by this law is to live by the quantum law. Okay. So, all of this material is in my book. The name of the book is called Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind. And I'm happy to say that it's 99% done. You know what the problem was? It was 750 pages. So we had to cut it back a little bit. Anyway, thank you for listening. You're a great audience.
To watch amazing Wayne Dyer video, check it out right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
We are keeping ourselves from a destiny that we signed up for. Whatever you need will begin to show up. The problem with most of us is that as it begins to show up, we then institute